My stepson's friend needed a place to stay, but it was my bed he ended up in today. I have a story that started with compassion and ended somewhere I never expected. It was supposed to be simple. My stepson's friend needed a place to crash, just for a night or two. He was polite, quiet, respectful. I didn't think twice, but sometimes the lines between comfort and connection blur in silence. The way he looked at me, the way he listened, it stirred something I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was just kindness, but that night, it wasn't the guest room he ended up in. It was my bed. And what happened next changed everything. If you think you've heard stories like this before, think again. Because nothing about what followed was simple. It was supposed to be one quiet night, just me, a book, and an empty house while my stepson was away. When his friend showed up unexpectedly, soaked from the rain and carrying only a backpack, I offered him the guest room without thinking twice. He had always been polite, quiet, and a little shy, but something in the way he looked at me that night, tired, vulnerable, and yet intensely focused, made my heart skip. I never imagined a simple act of kindness would take such a bold turn. What happened next still lingers in my thoughts, like an unanswered question. The rain had not let up all evening. I could hear it thudding gently against the windows, a steady rhythm that matched the soft crackling of the fireplace. I had just curled up on the couch with a blanket and a novel when the doorbell rang. I assumed it was a delivery or a neighbor. But when I opened the door, I found him Ethan, my stepson's friend, drenched hair plastered to his forehead and a sheepish expression on his face. He apologized immediately for the surprise and explained that his apartment flooded after a pipe burst and he had nowhere else to go. I invited him in without hesitation. Ethan had always been a quiet presence whenever he visited, polite to a fault, helpful in small ways, and respectful of my space. He would often help clean up after dinner or offer to carry in groceries. It was hard not to notice how much he had grown in the last year. He was no longer the lanky teen who used to tag along with my stepson. Now he was a young man, confident, tall, with eyes that seemed to carry thoughts too heavy for his age. I offered him the guest room and towels, and he gratefully accepted. I went to warm up some tea for both of us. When I returned to the living room, he was sitting at the edge of the couch, still looking uncomfortable. "You do not have to sit like a stranger," I joked, handing him the cup. He smiled, and I noticed the way his shoulders relaxed at my warmth. We chatted a little about his school, how he was doing, how surprised he was by the sudden flooding. His voice was calm, but there was something beneath the surface. I could sense it. After he settled in the guest room, I went to bed thinking nothing of it, but sleep did not come easily. My mind kept drifting back to the way his eyes lingered on mine, the way he had hesitated before entering the house, almost as if he had been afraid to cross some invisible line. I told myself I was imagining things. I was older, wiser, and not about to read into looks that were probably just gratitude. But a part of me stayed restless. Around 2:00 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I sat up, unsure if it was real or just part of a dream. But then I heard a soft knock. I opened the door, and there he was, shirtless, his sweatpants clinging to his waist, his eyes half closed but intense. "I could not sleep," he said softly, almost embarrassed. "Your couch." The guest room, I kept thinking. "I am sorry." I stepped aside without thinking, and he entered. We sat on the edge of my bed, the silence between us filled with unspoken things. He looked at me not with immaturity or recklessness, but with a strange mix of respect and longing. "You always made me feel safe," he whispered. Even when I did not know how to ask for it, his words hit me somewhere deep. I had not felt seen in so long. Not like that. I asked him gently, "What are you really looking for, Ethan?" He looked down, then back up with a kind of raw honesty that surprised me. "I do not know, just to be near you, to feel like I matter somewhere." My heart ached not just for him, but for myself too, for all the moments I had buried my own needs to care for others, for the silence I had learned to live in. I told him he should go back to the guest room, but the words felt thin, obligatory. He stood up slowly, but he did not walk away. He lingered as if waiting for me to change my mind. I did not yet. But something in the air had changed, something I could not quite ignore anymore. The next morning, the silence in the house was louder than the storm from the night before. I moved through my morning routine on autopilot: coffee, toast, feeding the cat, pretending nothing had shifted, but it had. I felt it in the way I avoided looking at the guest room door, and in the memory of Ethan's eyes in the dark. He had not said or done anything inappropriate, not really, but his presence had left a mark, one I was trying hard to ignore. When he emerged later dressed in borrowed clothes and slightly disheveled, he smiled cautiously. "Thanks again for everything," he said, his voice a little. I nodded, keeping my distance. I told myself it was temporary. He would find another place. He would be gone by the weekend, but the weekend came and he was still there. He fixed the squeaky kitchen drawer without being asked. He carried the laundry basket upstairs. He made coffee just the way I liked it. Slowly, effortlessly, he became part of the rhythm of my home, and I let him. One night while we were watching a movie, our hands accidentally touched on the couch. I did not pull away, neither did he. We sat there, our fingers brushing ever so slightly until the credits rolled. When I finally looked at him, I saw something gentle in his expression. Hope, maybe, or restraint. "I do not want to make you uncomfortable," he said, "but being near you feels different, like I can finally breathe." I exhaled slowly, unsure how to respond. I had told myself that I was older, wiser, that there were boundaries I would never cross. But somewhere between the loneliness I had learned to live with and the warmth he brought into my space, something had started to unravel. That night I lay awake for hours, heart racing. I could not ignore the quiet truth anymore. I was drawn to him, not just because he saw me, not just because he was kind or attentive or impossibly attractive. It was deeper than that. He had cracked something open in me, something I thought was long dead. The moment came 2 days later. I had just stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a robe towel, drying my hair. I walked into my room and found him standing by the window looking out at the rain. He turned around slowly as if he had heard my thoughts echoing. I knocked. The door was open. He said quietly. I did not speak. I just stood there, still letting the silence speak first. He walked toward me, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of certainty that made my breath catch. He stopped just short of touching me, giving me space to decide. "I can leave if you want," he said, voice steady. "But I do not want to lie anymore. I think about you all the time. I know this is complicated. I know I am younger, but I am not confused." I reached for his face before I even realized it, my fingers brushing along his jaw. It had been so long since someone had looked at me, like I was more than someone's mother, someone's ex-wife, someone's silent support system. He looked at me like I was a woman wanted alive. I kissed him. It was slow at first, uncertain, the kind of kiss that asks for permission with every breath. But then it deepened, hungry, urgent. My hands tangled in his shirt as his arms wrapped around my waist. I could feel every part of him, the strength in his hold, the restraint in the way he moved, the heat radiating from his body. When he laid me down, it was with a kind of reverence I had forgotten existed. There were no rushed movements, no awkward fumbling, just touch, honest, intentional, electrifying. He kissed every part of me like he had memorized it in a dream. His fingers traced the curve of my hip, the line of my shoulder, the space just below my collarbone. I felt war-ripped, seen in a way that had nothing to do with age or status or logic. We moved together with a rhythm that felt inevitable, like the unfolding of a story that had always been waiting to be told. I forgot the years between us. I forgot what the world would say. In that moment, it was just us, two people who had found something neither of us expected, but both of us needed. Afterwards, we lay there in silence, the storm outside echoing the quiet aftermath. He held my hand, his thumb moving in slow circles across my skin. I should have felt guilt, maybe even shame, but all I felt was peace. He looked at me and whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded, eyes wet but smiling. "Yes, strangely, I am." He kissed my forehead and pulled me closer. There was no talk of what it meant or what would come next, just the shared understanding that something had shifted for both of us, and I was no longer afraid of it. The next morning felt different. Not in a dramatic world-shifting way, but in the subtler, heavier silence that settled between us. Ethan was already in the kitchen making coffee like he had done so many times before. But this time he did not look up when I entered. The air between us felt charged, like something fragile had formed overnight and neither of us knew what to do with it. I stood across from him, waiting for him to speak, to look at me, to acknowledge what had happened. When he finally did, his eyes held something unfamiliar. "Worry. Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded too quickly. "Yes, I think so." We both laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that came with nervousness and an edge of uncertainty. He poured me a cup, slid it across the counter, and leaned against the sink like he was holding himself back. "I do not want you to feel like I took advantage," he said. "You did not," I replied quickly, my voice more firm than I expected. He looked at me again, longer this time. It felt real, more real than anything I have felt in a long time. I knew what he meant, because I felt it too. But reality was beginning to press in from the edges. I was old enough to understand consequences. And he, despite his confidence, was still tethered to the part of his life where nothing was permanent. "I do not regret it," I said slowly. "But it is not simple." He gave a small smile. "Nothing worth it ever is." It should have been comforting, but instead it opened a door I had been trying to keep shut. I started thinking about my stepson, how he would feel if he knew about the people around us who would never understand, who would reduce our connection to something sordid or reckless. I thought about the age gap, the judgment, the inevitable fallout. And yet even in the middle of that internal storm, I could not bring myself to wish it away. Later that day, while Ethan was out running errands, I stood in front of the mirror and saw myself differently. Not through the lens of regret or self-doubt, but through the gaze he had given me the night before. I traced the soft lines around my eyes, the curve of my mouth, the slope of my shoulders. For the first time in years, I did not look for flaws. I looked for truth. I was not the woman I used to be. I was not trying to be. And maybe that was the point. I had spent so long hiding behind the idea that passion had an expiration date, that romance belonged to younger, simpler lives. But what if I was wrong? What if there was still something waiting to bloom, something messy, something tender, something real? That evening, we sat on the porch watching the sun dip low behind the trees. The quiet between us felt different now, less tense, more curious. He turned to me and asked, "What are you thinking?" I paused, letting the question settle. "I am thinking, this is terrifying." He nodded slowly. "Me too, but I also feel awake." He smiled, that slow, steady kind of smile that made me feel like I was the only person in his world. "Then maybe we just take one day at a time." It sounded simple, but nothing about this was simple. The real test came when my stepson called to say he was coming by the next day to grab a few of his things. Ethan and I both stiffened. It was the first real moment where our little bubble had to face the world outside of it. "What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "We act normal because this, whatever it is ours, and we decide how and when to share it." He was right, but it did not make it easier. When my stepson arrived, Ethan greeted him casually, the way he always did. They talked, sports, caught up, laughed. I watched them from the kitchen, my heart thudding, half expecting something to crack open right there, but nothing did. The secret stayed safe, hidden behind practiced smiles and steady hands. After he left, Ethan walked up behind me and rested his hand on my back. I turned to face him. "I do not want to lie," I said, "but I also do not want to destroy anything." "We will not," he whispered. "We are just figuring it out." His words were like a thread stitching together all the torn edges inside me. For once, I was not holding everything alone. We were in something we could not name yet, but we were in it together. The days that followed were quieter, but not in a hollow way. They were filled with the kind of silence that felt like breathing after a long run, exhausted but alive. Ethan and I found a rhythm that was gentle and honest. We did not rush, we did not make promises we could not keep, we just showed up for each other moment by moment. One evening as we sat on the couch, no grand declarations, just sharing the space, he reached for my hand and held it like it was the most natural thing in the world. There was no more pretending, no more questioning if this was right or wrong, it just was. I looked at him, really looked at him, not as my stepson's friend, not as someone younger, not as a complication, but as a man who saw me, chose me, and made me feel like I mattered beyond labels or logic. This might not be easy, I said, my voice soft but sure. He squeezed my hand. Most beautiful things never are. I smiled, finally letting myself feel the weight of what we were building, something fragile but full of truth. I did not know what the future held. Maybe it would fall apart. Maybe it would flourish. But for the first time in a long time, I was open to possibility, and that felt more powerful than certainty. That night still lingers in my memory, not because of what happened, but because of what it awakened. I offered him a place to stay out of kindness, but somehow, somewhere along the way, the walls between empathy and desire crumbled, and I've asked myself 1,000 times since, did I cross a line? Or did I finally step into a truth I'd been denying for far too long? Some will say it was a moment of weakness. Others might say it was a cry for connection from two people who were both lost in their own ways. But where is the line between emotional need and emotional mistake? Between loneliness and something more dangerous? Was it betrayal? Or was it healing in the wrong hands? This story isn't about justifying. It's about questioning the kind of questions we're often too afraid to say out loud. So I ask you, what would you have done? Would you have stopped it, or would you have let it happen just to feel alive again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's not shy away from the uncomfortable truths. Follow me so I have more motivation to create more raw, honest stories like this one. Or simply encourage me by pressing number 1 in the comments. Your support gives me the strength to keep going.